Welcome to Sleeping Times. Imagine celebrating your birthday hidden in underground tunnels, whispering so you won't be executed. Now imagine that same celebration transformed into a global festival worth billions of dollars, broadcast by satellites, sold in shopping centers, celebrated even by people who've never heard of the person whose birth they're supposedly commemorating. How did a clandestine religious party of a persecuted sect become the most powerful cultural event on the planet? The journey of Christmas through 2,000 years is a story of impossible survival, radical transformations, cultural wars, and humanity's ability to create meaning even in the most unlikely circumstances. Tonight, we're going to travel from Roman catacombs to digital algorithms, discovering how soldiers in trenches, medieval monks, radical reformers, and even artificial intelligence shaped the Christmas you know today. If you want to learn history while you relax, subscribe now for stories like this every week. Oh, and don't forget to leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always amazing to see how our community is spread all around the world. Now, how about turning off the lights, finding a comfortable position, and preparing yourself for a 2,000-year journey through the rituals, ceremonies, and transformations of Christmas, from the first Christians celebrating in secret to you tonight listening to this story. Imagine for a moment the near absolute darkness of an underground corridor carved into volcanic rock beneath the hills of Rome. The air is dense, heavy with moisture, and the earthy smell of ancient stone. It is the end of the 2nd century, and small groups of people descend silently down narrow staircases, carrying oil lamps that flicker against the irregular walls. There are no bells, no public hymns, no grandeur that we associate with modern Christmas. There is only the murmur of whispered prayers and the soft scraping of sandals against the stone floor. These are the catacombs of Rome, and here, in the bowels of the earth, far from the watchful eyes of the empire, the first Christian rituals are born. Rituals that celebrate something extraordinary, the arrival of light into the world. In those first centuries, celebrating the birth of Christ was not simply a choice, it was an act of silent resistance. The Roman Empire, with all its pomp and power, demanded worship of its emperors as living deities. To refuse was considered treason, punishable by death. So how would you celebrate something sacred when doing so could cost you your life? The first Christians found their answer in clandestinity. The catacombs, originally created as cemeteries, became improvised sanctuaries. Between the funeral niches, called loculi, where the bodies of martyrs rested, small chapels took shape. It was there, surrounded by the constant reminder of death and sacrifice, that the celebration of birth gained profound meaning. Life conquering death, hope blooming in the deepest darkness. But what exactly did these first believers celebrate? Here is something fascinating. For nearly 3 centuries, there was no consensus about when Christ was born. Some Christian communities commemorated in January, others in March, still others in April. There were no precise birth records, and the very notion of celebrating birthdays was viewed with suspicion. After all, it was a pagan custom associated with Roman emperors and gods. Primitive Christians focused far more on Easter, on resurrection, than on birth. So, how and why did Christmas begin to gain importance? The answer is intertwined with a cultural challenge that seems strangely familiar even today. How do you maintain your identity amid a dominant culture that celebrates something completely different? In the Roman winter, especially near the solstice, the city exploded with festivities. Saturnalia, dedicated to the god Saturn, transformed Rome into a carnival where social norms were temporarily inverted. Slaves dined with their masters, betting and drinking flowed freely, gifts were exchanged. Soon after came Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birth of the unconquered sun, celebrated on December 25th, a festival that Emperor Aurelian instituted in 274 AD to unify the empire through a solar cult. The streets blazed with torches, temples overflowed with incense, and animal sacrifices marked the renewal of light after the shortest days of the year. For Christians, it was impossible to ignore this fervor. Can you imagine the tension? How do you celebrate your faith when the entire city around you feasts to gods you reject? The answer came slowly, organically, through what we might call a strategy of sacred reinterpretation. If the Romans celebrated the birth of the unconquered sun, Christians began to reflect, would not Christ be the true Son of Justice, the true light that came into the world? Christian writers of the 3rd century, like Hippolytus of Rome, began to calculate and propose dates for the birth of Jesus. Some of these reflections were complex mathematics based on Jewish calendars and the supposed date of conception. Others were symbolic, seeking to align Christ's arrival with cosmically significant moments. Gradually, December 25th emerged not as a historically proven date, but as a theological and strategic choice to proclaim that the true light had been born precisely when the empire celebrated a false sun. But let us return to those damp catacombs where celebrations took place far from daylight. What were these first Christmas rituals like? The word ritual perhaps is too generous. They were simple gatherings, almost informal compared to what would come later. A presbyter, an elder of the community, conducted the meeting. There were no elaborate vestments, just the ordinary clothes of the day, perhaps a tunic slightly cleaner for the occasion. The group gathered around a small stone table, often the tombstone of a martyr, which served as an altar. Upon it, bread and wine, the elements of the Eucharist, the absolute center of primitive Christian liturgy. The light of oil lamps cast dancing shadows on walls decorated with simple frescoes, fish, anchors, the Good Shepherd, symbols that communicated faith through discrete visual language. The liturgy began with readings. There were no printed gospels that each person could hold. Texts were rare, copied by hand on parchment or papyrus, precious communal property. Someone read aloud, perhaps from the Gospel of Luke, that familiar narrative of Caesar Augustus's decree, of the journey to Bethlehem, of the manger, because there was no room at the inn. The words echoed softly against the stone walls, and you can imagine how each detail resonated differently in that context. An empire that persecuted them, a political authority that forced displacement, the marginalization of a couple giving birth in precarious conditions. It was not merely an ancient story, it was a mirror of their own lives. Then came the Psalms, sung in simple, meditative tones, voices interweaving without instrumental accompaniment, creating a pure and human harmony that filled that underground space. The most sacred moment was the Eucharist. The presbyter repeated the words that had been passed down orally since the apostles. On the night he was betrayed, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and said, "This is my body." There was profound solemnity, but also an intimacy impossible to replicate. Everyone knew everyone, not by choice, but by necessity. These were small communities, united by shared risk. The bread was broken and passed from hand to hand. The wine circulated in a single chalice, each person drinking from it. There were no pews, so many stood or knelt directly on the cold stone. Physical discomfort was part of the experience, a way of participating in the suffering they also celebrated transcending. And all around, always present, the darkness beyond the circle of light, a constant reminder that they lived under threat. Have you ever stopped to think about how we celebrate when we are under pressure? Today we live in societies where, for most, religious freedom is constitutionally guaranteed. We can go to an illuminated church with modern sound systems, comfortable seating, without fear of being arrested when we leave. But there are places in the world even now where Christians gather in secret, where a Bible can be grounds for imprisonment, where singing a hymn too loudly might alert the authorities. In those places, Christmas regains that primitive quality. It is not about decorated trees or wrapped presents, but about affirming an identity and a hope that no earthly power can extinguish. The Christians of the catacombs would understand those modern believers perfectly. They knew that sometimes celebrating is, in itself, a revolutionary act. There was also an essential communal dimension to these celebrations. After the Eucharist came the agape, the meal of brotherly love. Each person brought what they could: bread, olives, cheese, dried fruit, perhaps a bit of salted fish. It was not a banquet, but it was shared with radical equality. In a rigidly hierarchical Roman society where slaves ate scraps and patricians reclined on couches during elaborate feasts, this simple underground meal was subversive. Rich and poor, masters and converted slaves all sat together, eating from the same sources. Conversations happened in whispers, news from other communities, reports of recent arrests, stories of conversions, prayers for those facing trials. In these whispered conversations, Christmas became more than memory of the past. It became active hope for the future. The children present, and there were children at these gatherings, learned faith not through elaborate Sunday school programs, but through observation and participation. They saw adults risk their safety to gather. They heard stories told with urgency, not as mere narratives, but as the foundation of identity. They grew up understanding that their faith cost something, that belonging to that community meant accepting risks. And when they finally could participate in the Eucharist after baptism, the moment carried weight. Compare this to the experience of many children today in Christian contexts. Christmas can seem automatic, cultural, even commercial. Faith is inherited as family tradition, not as a risky choice. There are gains and losses in this shift, comfort and security, yes, but perhaps also a dilution of that intensity, that acute awareness that one is choosing something countercultural. It is important to note that we do not idealize this period. Life in the catacombs was not romantically courageous, it was often terrifying. Persecutions came in waves. Sometimes Christians lived for decades in relative peace, their gatherings tolerated as long as they kept a low profile. Other times, a particularly zealous emperor, Decius in 250, Valerian in 257, Diocletian in 303, launched systematic persecutions. Lists were made, properties confiscated, leaders hunted. During these periods, celebrating Christmas became even more dangerous and more essential. Some communities simply stopped gathering, dispersing until the storm passed. Others insisted on maintaining the rituals, even if it meant death. These choices were not easy or obvious. There were debates, divisions, accusations of cowardice or suicidal recklessness. Faith was tested not in theological abstractions but in concrete decisions, to go or not to go to the gathering knowing that informants might be watching. The martyrs, those who chose to die rather than renounce, became central to primitive Christian identity and consequently to Christmas rituals. Many Eucharistic celebrations happened literally over the tombs of martyrs, and the anniversary of a martyr's death, their birth into eternal life, was commemorated with special reverence. There was a beautiful theological symmetry. Christ was born to die and rise again. The martyrs died to be born into eternal life. So, when they celebrated the birth of Christ in the catacombs, surrounded by the remains of friends and family who had given their lives, the message of Christmas gained layers. Birth and death, sacrifice and hope, present and future, woven inseparably together. Can you feel the difference between this and a contemporary Christmas sermon about cute babies and mangers? The art that decorated these catacombs also told a story, In the earliest frescoes, there are practically no images of the birth of Christ as we know it. There are no detailed mangers, no Mary holding an aureate baby, no wise men with golden gifts. Instead, there are symbols: the Good Shepherd carrying a sheep, the fish, ichthys, an acronym for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Saviour, in Greek, the anchor of hope, the bread and fish of multiplication. When human figures appear, they are schematic, almost abstract. Why? Part of this came from Christianity's Jewish heritage, with its caution regarding carved images. Part was practical. Elaborate art would attract unwanted attention. But there was also a theological understanding. The birth of Christ mattered not for visual details, but for meaning. God becoming human, the divine entering the ordinary. The symbol was sufficient. Elaboration would come centuries later. So, what do these first Christians in the catacombs teach us about Christmas? Perhaps this: that the essence of celebration does not depend on external circumstances. They did not have majestic churches, professional music, elaborate gifts, or social approval. They had a story they believed to be true and transformative, a community willing to risk everything to gather, and the conviction that light had entered the world in a way that no darkness could extinguish. They celebrated not because it was comfortable or culturally expected, but because they needed to affirm, against all evidence around them, that hope was justified. And as the oil lamps flickered in the Roman catacombs, casting restless shadows against images of shepherds and fish, they sang softly of a baby born in impossible circumstances who, somehow, would change everything. But how would these hidden celebrations evolve when persecution finally ended and the doors of the catacombs opened to daylight? In the year 312 AD, something unthinkable happened. Constantine, a Roman general fighting for control of the empire, had a vision, or so the story goes. Before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, near Rome, he would have seen a luminous cross in the sky with the words "In hoc signo vinces." Under this sign, conquer. Constantine won the battle, became emperor, and the following year, through the Edict of Milan, granted religious tolerance to Christians. For the first time in 3 centuries, being Christian was not a crime. The doors of the catacombs opened, and those who had whispered prayers in darkness could now sing in the sunlight. But here is the intriguing question. When persecution ended, when faith ceased to be dangerous and became acceptable, even favored, what happened to the essence of those primitive celebrations? Christmas left the shadows, but what did it gain and what did it lose in that transformation? The change was not instantaneous, but it was profound. Constantine did not merely tolerate Christianity, he embraced it as a political tool to unify his fragmented empire. Imperial money began to flow toward the construction of churches. The first and most famous was the Basilica of St. Peter, built over the supposed tomb of the Apostle in Rome. Others followed. The Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, erected on the site that Helena, Constantine's mother, identified as the place of crucifixion and resurrection. These were not modest structures. They were architectural declarations of power, with massive marble columns plundered from pagan temples, golden mosaics that gleamed in the light of thousands of candles, high ceilings that made voices echo dramatically. Imagine the shock for those Christians who had celebrated for decades in tight, dark spaces. Suddenly, their faith occupied the most magnificent buildings in the cities. With this new freedom and resources, Christmas rituals began to formalize and expand. What had been a relatively simple celebration, readings, psalms, Eucharist, a shared meal, began to gain layers of ceremony. Bishops, now important public figures instead of clandestine leaders, presided over elaborate liturgies. Specific liturgical vestments were introduced, distinguishing clergy from laity. Incense, which had been used sporadically and cautiously before, became a constant element, its fragrant clouds rising through the cavernous spaces of the new basilicas. Choirs were organized, no longer informal groups singing from memory, but trained groups performing increasingly complex melodies. Christmas was becoming a spectacle, a public performance of faith that communicated not merely devotion, but also status and institutional power. This institutionalization brought standardization. Before, different Christian communities celebrated Christmas in slightly different ways, on different dates, with varying theological emphases. Now, with bishops communicating more freely and ecclesiastical councils being convened, a process of uniformization began. December 25th was officially established as the universal date for Christmas, definitively superseding the festivities of the unconquered sun. It was not coincidence, it was deliberate strategy. If the empire had celebrated the birth of the sun on that date, now it would celebrate the birth of the one Christians called the Son of Justice. It was a tactic of cultural substitution. Keep the familiar date, but completely transform its meaning. Can you see the parallel with how modern cultures absorb and reinterpret traditions? How modern commercial Christmas took a religious festival and transformed it into a festival of consumption, keeping some symbols but radically altering the meaning. But not everyone was happy with these changes. Critical voices emerged from within the Christian community itself. There were those who looked with suspicion upon the new grandiose churches and elaborate rituals. We are becoming like the pagans we criticized, some argued. Where is the simplicity of the apostles? Where is the focus on spirit instead of spectacle? A particularly vocal group was the monks, men and women who chose to withdraw to the desert, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, seeking a purer and more ascetic form of Christianity. For them, Christmas should be celebrated in fasting and contemplative prayer, not in elaborate feasts. Anthony of Egypt, one of the fathers of Christian monasticism, would have said that the true birth that mattered was the birth of Christ in the soul of each believer through self-denial. It was a cutting critique. Was Christianity winning the world but losing its soul? This tension between the institutional church growing in power and influence and ascetic movements seeking spiritual purity would shape Christianity for the centuries to come. And it reflected directly in how Christmas was celebrated. In the cities, celebrations became increasingly elaborate. In the monasteries of the desert and later of Europe, Christmas was marked by deliberate simplicity, nighttime vigils of prayer, extensive scripture readings, fasting until the Eucharistic celebration. Two Christmases, we might say, coexisting within the same religious tradition. Does this sound familiar to you? Today, Christmas also exists in multiple versions: the commercial, the familial, the religious, the secular. And within modern Christianity itself, there are constant debates about the true meaning of Christmas, with different Christian groups celebrating in radically different ways, from elaborate masses to simple home gatherings. The relationship between church and state under Constantine and his successors also created new challenges. When your faith is persecuted, your identity is clear. You are against the system. But when your faith becomes the religion favored by the empire, when bishops dine with senators and the emperor convenes religious councils, the lines blur. Christmas became not merely a religious celebration, but also an occasion for political display. Emperors attended grand Christmas liturgies, their presence sanctifying the event and, simultaneously, legitimizing their own power. God chose our emperor just as he chose Christ to be born. The subliminal message was clear. This created a problematic fusion between political and religious authority that would persist for centuries. Can you think of moments in recent or current history where religion and politics intertwine in problematic ways, where religious celebrations are used for nationalist or ideological purposes? Liturgically, the 4th century saw the development of what we know as the Christian liturgical year. a structured calendar of celebrations and seasons that organized the life of the church. Christmas became not merely a day, but the center of a season. Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas, was established as a period of preparation and expectation. Epiphany, celebrated on January 6th, commemorated the manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles through the visit of the Magi. Between Christmas and Epiphany lay the 12 days of Christmas, a continuous period of celebration. This temporal structuring was brilliant in pastoral terms. Instead of a single day that could easily become merely festive, there were weeks of preparation that shaped the consciousness of the faithful, building anticipation and reflection. Compare this to modern commercial Advent, where preparation for Christmas often means frantic shopping mall runs, financial stress, and exhaustion, rather than spiritual contemplation. The biblical readings associated with Christmas were also standardized during this period. The Gospel of Luke, with its detailed narrative of birth, the census, the journey to Bethlehem, the shepherds, the angels, became the primary reading of the Midnight Mass, a liturgical tradition that began to solidify in the 4th century. The Gospel of John, with its majestic theological prologue, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God," was read at the Mass of the day. There was genius in this choice. Luke offered the story, the historical event, accessible and moving. John offered the profound theological interpretation, the cosmic significance. Together they created a complete experience. These same readings are still used in most Christian churches today, a liturgical continuity of nearly 1700 years. How many other cultural or religious practices can claim such longevity? Music was also revolutionized. Before Constantine, Christian music was primarily psalms sung in simple melodies, often adapted from Jewish traditions. But in the 4th century, original Christian hymns began to appear, compositions that did not merely cite scriptures, but interpreted them poetically. These hymns, many in Latin in Western churches and in Greek in the East, began to educate the faithful theologically. A famous example is the Te Deum, a hymn of praise that, though not specifically Christmas-related, was frequently sung at Christmas celebrations. Its lyrics combine exuberant worship with precise doctrine. For a largely illiterate population, these hymns were schools of theology. You memorize the melody, and with it, you memorize the doctrine. Music became pedagogy. It is no different from how we learn today. Songs stick in our minds in ways lectures cannot. The question is, what are we memorizing through modern Christmas songs? Jingle Bells and Rudolph teach anything beyond nostalgia and commercialism. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological and social. In the catacombs, being Christian was a costly choice that defined your identity against society. After Constantine, being Christian became progressively advantageous and eventually, under later emperors like Theodosius, mandatory. Christianity went from persecuted sect to the official religion of the empire. This meant that people became Christian not necessarily from deep conviction, but from social convenience, political advantage, or simply because everyone around them was. The church is filled, but with a multitude of believers of varying commitment. Ecclesiastical leaders now faced an unprecedented problem. How do you maintain religious fervor when faith costs nothing? How do you celebrate Christmas with depth when your audience includes both devoted mystics and nominal Christians who are there because it is socially expected? The answer came partly through the creation of a total sensory experience in Christmas liturgies. If people did not come with spiritual depth, perhaps they could be led to it through the senses. Enter the newly constructed basilicas on a Christmas night of the 4th century. The space is illuminated by hundreds of candles and oil lamps, creating a golden light that dances on the walls. The air is thick with incense, not just one kind, but multiple: frankincense, myrrh, storax, each adding its note to the olfactory symphony. The walls are lined with mosaics that capture and reflect light, creating the impression that the space itself is glowing. The choir sings, their trained voices creating harmonies that the basilica's acoustics amplify and enrich. The bishop enters in procession dressed in ornate vestments, often donated by wealthy patrons of the church. It is overwhelming, meant to be overwhelming. The idea is that even if your mind wanders, even if you do not understand Latin or Greek, your body and senses are captured by the experience. You leave different, touched by something greater than yourself. Did this approach succeed? It depends on how we measure. On one hand, Christianity spread rapidly throughout the empire after Constantine. Pagan temples were converted to churches or abandoned. The cultural calendar became Christian. Christmas replaced Saturnalia as the great winter celebration. But on the other hand, we constantly hear complaints from preachers and writers of that period about Christians celebrating Christmas in pagan ways, drinking excessively, feasting uncontrollably, treating the date as a secular holiday rather than a sacred one. John Chrysostom, one of the most eloquent preachers of the 4th century, lamented that many Christians spent Christmas Eve in theatres and banquets instead of in prayer vigils. Does this sound familiar? The tension between the sacred and secular in Christmas is not a modern invention. It was present from the moment Christmas left the catacombs. There were also questions of syncretism, the mixing of pagan and Christian practices. Some Roman winter traditions were so culturally rooted that they were simply absorbed into Christian celebrations, sometimes with creative theological justifications. The custom of decorating homes with persistent green plants, holly, ivy, evergreens, came from pagan practices that celebrated life in the midst of winter, but was Christianized with new meanings. The green represented eternal life through Christ. The red berries of holly symbolized the blood of Christ. It was religious cultural appropriation, essentially. Church leaders debated how far this was acceptable. Some argued pragmatically, if we can give new Christian meanings to old practices, we facilitate people's transition from paganism to Christianity. Others were purists. Anything with pagan origins should be completely rejected. This debate was never fully resolved, and it still echoes today when modern Christians discuss whether Christmas trees or Santa Claus are appropriate in religious celebrations. So, what do we make of this era of transition when Christmas emerged from the catacombs and entered the basilicas? Was it a net gain or a loss? The honest answer is both. There were gains in reach, artistic beauty, theological development, and institutional continuity. The liturgies became richer, the music more complex, the architecture more inspiring. Christmas became a cultural force capable of shaping entire societies. But something was also lost, that intensity of the catacombs, that clarity of purpose, that sharp distinction between the church and the world. When everyone is Christian, what does it mean to be Christian? When Christmas is a mandatory cultural holiday, what remains of its countercultural power? These questions haunted 4th century Christians, and they still haunt us today. And as candles gleamed in the new and magnificent basilicas, illuminating more brightly than those oil lamps of the catacombs ever could, some wondered, is a brighter light always better at illuminating? Or does it sometimes blind us to what matters most to see? But the story of Christmas was only beginning its long journey through the centuries, and the transformations ahead would be as dramatic as they were unpredictable. As the Roman Empire crumbled in the West, Rome sacked in 410, the last emperor deposed in 476, Europe descended into what would later be called, perhaps unfairly, the Dark Ages. Cities shrank, trade routes broke apart, literacy plummeted. But amid this civilizational collapse, one institution not only survived but flourished: the Church. Monasteries became islands of learning and stability in a sea of chaos. And within these monasteries, Christmas rituals not only persisted but evolved in ways that would completely transform how Christendom understood and celebrated the birth of Christ. Here is a fascinating question. When social order crumbles, when security disappears, how do people celebrate hope? Medieval Christmas offers us a surprising answer, through dramatized imagination, transforming sacred history into lived experience. The Benedictine monasteries, following the rule of Saint Benedict written in the 6th century, structured each day around 8 periods of prayer called the canonical hours: matins, in the dead of night; lauds, at dawn; prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Christmas intensified this already rigorous rhythm. From Christmas Eve onward, the monks began a vigil that extended through the entire night, alternating between chanting, scripture readings, and contemplative silence. Imagine the scene: a stone monastic church, only partially heated by a few braziers, the cold of December penetrating through thick walls. The monks, dressed in their wool habits, stood in the choir stalls hour after hour, their voices echoing in the darkness. There were no clocks marking minutes, only the slow and solemn unfolding of the divine office. Gregorian chant, which reached its mature form in this period, created an atmosphere of timelessness, its modal melodies flowing without the rhythmic urgency of modern music, inducing an almost meditative state. But it was in the 9th century that something truly innovative began to happen in medieval churches: liturgical drama. It all began modestly. During the Easter Mass in some monasteries, monks began to add small dramatized dialogues to traditional chants. At the entrance of the empty tomb, one monk would ask, "Whom do you seek?" Others would respond, "Jesus of Nazareth. He is not here, he has risen." It was rudimentary theatre, but its impact was explosive. For the first time, the biblical narrative was not merely read or sung, but enacted, brought to 3-dimensional life. The success of these Easter tropes quickly led to the creation of Christmas dramatizations, and so were born the first living nativity scenes and representations of the nativity, not as static decorations, but as performances that invited the faithful to witness again that birth in Bethlehem. The most famous of these dramatizations was created by Saint Francis of Assisi in 1223 in the Italian village of Greccio. Francis, deeply dissatisfied with the growing theological abstraction and institutionalization of the Church, wanted common people to feel the humanity and poverty of Jesus' birth. On Christmas Eve, he set up a real manger with real hay, brought a live ox and donkey, and celebrated Mass in the midst of this scene. These were not actors playing Mary and Joseph. Francis focused on the physical elements, on the materiality of the story. People from the village came, and according to contemporary accounts, many wept at seeing the recreation. Francis preached about how God chose to be born not in a palace, but in a stable, not wrapped in silk, but in plain cloth. For the poor peasants of Greccio, this resonated deeply. God understood their poverty because he had chosen it voluntarily. Can you see how this was radically different from Christmas in the grand cathedrals with their gold and incense? Francis was saying, true Christmas is simple, humble, accessible. But Christmas dramatization did not stop there. By the late Middle Ages, many churches presented elaborate mystery plays, theatrical productions that could last hours or even days, telling the entire story of salvation, from creation to the final judgment, with Christmas as one of the central episodes. These plays were often performed in the churchyard or in village squares, not inside the sacred building, and involved the entire community. Local merchants played shepherds, the blacksmith could be Joseph, the baker's wife represented Mary. The wise men rode real horses through the village streets in procession. Angels, usually children in white garments with wings made of goose feathers, were suspended by ropes and flew over the scene. There were elements of comedy too. The shepherds were often portrayed as comic figures, grumbling about the cold before receiving the angelic message. Herod was the theatrical villain par excellence, shouting and gesticulating wildly. It was entertainment, religious education, and communal ritual fused into a unique experience. These plays also served a crucial social function. In the rigidly hierarchical medieval society where nobles and peasants inhabited practically separate worlds, Christmas was one of the few moments of social mixing. During the celebrations, especially the dramatizations, everyone participated. The feudal lord watched from a privileged position, but was present in the same square as his serfs. And within the Christmas narrative itself was a subversive inversion of social order. The powerful, Herod, the Roman Empire, were obstacles or villains, while the humble, Mary, Joseph, shepherds, were the heroes. The first to receive news of the birth of the Messiah were not priests or kings, but shepherds, the lowest class of Palestinian society, considered impure and untrustworthy by the religious elite. This inversion was celebrated explicitly in the plays, and for a few hours at least, the poor could feel validation of their humanity and dignity. This did not change social structures, but it offered temporary relief and perhaps a seed of questioning. If God chose the humble, who are really the favored? Christmas music also flourished in the Middle Ages in ways that still resonate today. Christmas carols, or carols, emerged as a distinct musical form. Unlike formal liturgical hymns in Latin sung by trained choirs, carols were in the vernacular, English, French, German, Italian, and intended to be sung by ordinary people. They had catchy melodies and repetitive refrains that facilitated memorization. Some of the oldest surviving carols have a charming and raw quality. The Friendly Beasts, for example, is told from the perspective of the animals in the stable, the donkey that carried Mary, the cow that offered her hay, the sheep that gave its wool for the baby's clothes. It is simple, almost childlike, but precisely because of this, it was accessible. These songs were sung not only in churches but in homes, taverns, and on the streets, transforming Christmas into a communal experience that extended beyond the boundaries of the religious building. Within the Gothic cathedrals that began to rise from the 12th century onward, Christmas gained another dimension of splendor. These architectural structures were themselves sermons in stone and glass. The stained glass windows transformed sunlight into cascades of color, deep blues, vibrant reds, luminous golds, and many of them told the Christmas story in sequential panels. An illiterate peasant could enter a cathedral and read the Christmas story simply by looking at the windows. The angel Gabriel announcing to Mary the journey to Bethlehem, the birth in the manger, the adoration of the shepherds, the arrival of the wise men. They were giant picture books designed to teach. And on Christmas morning, when the rising sun entered through the eastern windows, illuminating the altar, the effect was calculated to inspire awe. Light itself became a symbol of the true light coming into the world. Can you imagine the psychological impact on someone who lived in a dark, one-room house, heated only by a fireplace, suddenly entering this luminous, colorful, and vast space? Yet it would be too romantic to ignore darker aspects of medieval Christmas. The church of that era was also an institution of immense power, and Christmas was used to reinforce hierarchies and doctrines. There was a coercive side to the celebrations. Attending Christmas Mass was not optional for most. It was social and religious obligation. The church levied taxes, tithes, and expected extra donations during Christmas, which could be a real burden for peasant families already living on the margin of subsistence. There was also a disturbing anti-Semitic dimension in some medieval Christmas dramatizations. Since the Christmas narrative included Herod and the massacre of the innocents, some plays portrayed Jews in caricatured and hostile ways, contributing to prejudices that led to real violence. It is a reminder that religious traditions, no matter how beautiful in theory, are always embodied by imperfect people in imperfect societies, carrying the prejudices of their age. Food and feasting were integral parts of medieval Christmas, but stratified by class. For the nobility, the Christmas dinner was an extraordinary banquet that could last hours. Roasted swans, whole boars, peacocks refeathered for spectacular appearance, elaborate pies, spiced wines called hippocras, and at the end, flaming puddings brought in procession. It was deliberate excess, a demonstration of wealth and generosity. The feudal lord traditionally should open his hall to vassals for at least part of the banquet, offering food and beer, a gesture of noblesse oblige that paradoxically reinforced both the generosity and the superiority of the lord. For peasants, Christmas was one of the rare occasions to eat meat, usually a goose or pig they had been fattening throughout the year. There was also special bread, sometimes with dried fruit incorporated, and strong beer. After weeks of Advent, which was technically a fasting period, though less rigorous than Lent, Christmas represented relief, relative abundance, and celebration. There is a particularly intriguing medieval tradition called the Feast of Fools, or Feast of the Ass, celebrated around the time of Christmas in some parts of Europe. It was a ritual of complete inversion. Junior priests assumed the roles of bishops, a boy bishop was elected, and for one day the normal hierarchies of the church were turned upside down. There were elements of liturgical parody, with sacred texts being sung backward or replaced by nonsense, incense made from old leather burned instead of frankincense, and processions where a donkey was brought into the church in memory of the donkey that carried Mary. It was grotesque, comic, and ecclesiastical authorities frequently tried to suppress it, seeing it as disrespectful. But it persisted because it served a vital psychological function. It was a pressure valve, allowing social tensions and frustrations with authority to be expressed in ritualized and temporary form. After the controlled chaos of the Feast of Fools, normal order was restored, perhaps even strengthened, because temporary transgression had relieved the pressure. It is similar, in a way, to moments in our modern cultures when norms are temporarily suspended, festivals, carnivals, or even the way more relaxed behavior is tolerated at year-end parties. Medieval winter was brutally difficult. Most people lived in conditions we would consider intolerable: constant cold, darkness, few candles or lamps due to cost, monotonous and limited diet, constant fear of disease and death. Infant mortality was terrifyingly high. Losing half or more of your children before they reached adulthood was common experience. In this context, Christmas acquired profound existential meaning. Celebrating the birth of a sacred child was, in part, an act of defiance against the death that surrounded all children. The story of Jesus escaping Herod's attempt to kill him resonated with special acuteness, and the central theological promise that God had entered human vulnerability, experienced the fragility of being a helpless baby, offered comfort. God was not a distant and impassive divinity, but someone who understood the human condition intimately because he had lived it from the moment of greatest vulnerability. Can you see how the same story can mean radically different things depending on the context of who hears it? Marian devotion also flourished in the Middle Ages and became deeply intertwined with Christmas celebrations. Mary was not merely the mother of Jesus, she became a figure of central veneration in her own right. Cathedrals were dedicated to Our Lady, Notre Dame in Paris, for example. Christmas hymns frequently focused as much or more on Mary as on Jesus himself. Alma Redemptoris Mater, one of the Marian hymns sung during the Christmas season, portrays Mary as an essential mediator between sinful humanity and holy divinity. For medieval women especially, Mary offered a figure with whom to identify. Mary's experience, pregnancy, childbirth, caring for a baby, was something every woman who had been a mother understood directly. The mysteries and pains of childbirth were not theological abstractions, but lived realities. So when they contemplated Mary in Bethlehem, there was a visceral connection, and the artistic representations of Mary with the Christ child, which proliferated during the Middle Ages, carried this human tenderness. A mother looking at her son, regardless of theological implications, was something universally understandable and moving. By the end of the Middle Ages, Christmas had transformed into a multifaceted cultural phenomenon. It was solemn liturgical ritual, participatory popular drama, communal feast, artistic expression through music and architecture, and a moment of reflection on the central mysteries of Christian faith. But there was a growing tension that would become explosive between the institutional church with its elaborate ceremonies and rigid hierarchies, and reform impulses that sought to return to more primitive simplicity. Reformist voices were already questioning where in all of this, in the elaborate plays, the excessive banquets, even in the masses sung in Latin that most did not understand, was the simple Jesus of Nazareth. Where was the gospel of the poor and marginalized? And these questions were about to break forth in ways that would crack Christendom in half. As the bells of Gothic cathedrals rang throughout medieval Europe in that last great age of Christian unity, few imagined that in just a few generations, even the celebration of Christmas would become a theological battlefield, and in some places would be prohibited entirely. But the storm of the Reformation was still to come, and with it, Christmas would face its most severe test. On October 31st, 1517, an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther supposedly nailed 95 theses to the door of the church of Wittenberg Castle, challenging practices of the Catholic Church, especially the sale of indulgences. What began as academic theological debate quickly transformed into a religious revolution that would permanently crack Western Christendom. The Protestant Reformation questioned everything: papal authority, clerical celibacy, the sacraments, the veneration of saints, masses in Latin, ecclesiastical wealth. And inevitably, Christmas too came under theological scrutiny. Here is a provocative question. Can a religious festival become so encrusted with traditions that it loses its essence? And if so, is the solution reform or abolition? Protestants debated these questions fiercely, and their answers shaped how, or whether, Christmas would be celebrated in the centuries to come. Luther personally had a complex relationship with Christmas. On one hand, he valued the celebration of Christ's birth as a central event in salvation history. Luther wrote Christmas hymns, including the famous "From Heaven Above to Earth I Come," intended for families to sing at home. He apparently brought a tree into his house and decorated it with candles, creating one of the first documented Christmas trees, though this story is debated by historians. For Luther, Christmas should focus on the gospel message: justification by faith, God's free grace, the incarnation as an act of incomprehensible divine love. But he was a fierce critic of elements he considered Catholic superstitions: excessive veneration of Mary, pilgrimages to supposedly miraculous nativity scenes, intercessory masses paid for by the wealthy to guarantee blessings. Luther wanted a simpler Christmas, more focused on Scripture, more accessible to common families in their homes. But other reformers were far more radical. Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich and John Calvin in Geneva were deeply suspicious of any celebration that lacked explicit biblical mandate. They argued, where in the Bible does God order us to celebrate Christ's birth? There is no such command. Jesus did not say, "Do this in remembrance of my birth," but rather, "Do this in remembrance of me," regarding the Eucharist related to his death and resurrection. Therefore, according to these reformers, Christmas was human tradition, not divine mandate, and should be eliminated. Calvin was particularly relentless. In Geneva, under his leadership, celebrating Christmas was prohibited. Churches remained closed on December 25th. Anyone found feasting or even refraining from work on that day could be fined or imprisoned. Calvin argued that maintaining Christmas was compromise with Catholic idolatry and distraction from true worship, which should occur every Sunday without special distinction for dates invented by the corrupt church. In Scotland, Calvin's followers, the Presbyterians, went even further. For nearly 400 years, from the mid-16th century until 1958, Christmas was effectively banned in Scotland. It was not an official holiday. Churches did not hold special services. Celebrating was seen as popery, something for Catholics and Anglicans. Enforcement was serious. Historical records show cases of people being prosecuted by the Kirk, the church, for baking special bread or decorating their homes on Christmas Day. The Scots developed an alternative winter celebration, Hogmanay, New Year's Eve, which became the main winter festival, a secular celebration without problematic religious connotations. Only after World War II, with cultural influences from England and America, did Christmas gradually return to Scotland. Can you imagine growing up in a Christian culture where Christmas simply does not exist, where the greatest Christian festival is deliberately ignored? In England, the situation was even more turbulent because it involved not merely theology, but politics and national identity. Henry VIII broke with Rome in 1534, but maintained many Catholic practices, including elaborate Christmas celebrations. But when the Puritans, English Calvinists, gained power, especially during the English Civil War and the period of the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, 1640s-1650s, they attempted to abolish Christmas completely. In 1644 and 1647, the Puritan Parliament passed laws declaring Christmas illegal. Churches were ordered to remain open for normal work. Markets should operate normally. No festivities were permitted. Soldiers patrolled the streets on December 25th, looking for signs of celebration, decorated doors, smells of special cooking. People gathered festively. The official justification was that Christmas promoted drunkenness, gluttony, and frivolity when people should be focused on sincere devotion. But there was also an element of social control. Eliminating a traditional moment of relaxation and inversion of norms helped maintain stricter order. The popular response was resistance. Many people, even those who were not particularly religious, loved Christmas for cultural and social reasons. It was a time of family gathering, of special food after a difficult winter, of brief joy in lives often harsh. Pro-Christmas riots erupted in several English cities. In Canterbury in 1647, crowds in the streets shouted, "Give us our Christmas," confronting Puritan authorities. There were satirical pamphlets circulating, lamenting the death of Christmas. One of them, "The Vindication of Christmas," personified Christmas as an old gentleman being unjustly expelled from England, having served faithfully for centuries. It was effective propaganda. It transformed the question from theological dogma to English tradition being attacked by fanatics. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, one of the first changes was the official return of Christmas. People celebrated not merely the return of the king, but the return of their favorite festival. This experience of banned Christmas left deep cultural marks. In later English literature, there is a current of nostalgia for traditional Christmas in contrast to more austere versions. Charles Dickens, writing in the 19th century, would crystallize this nostalgia in A Christmas Carol, portraying the ideal Christmas as a time of generosity, family festivity, and social reconciliation, all in opposition to the kind of austerity that Scrooge and implicitly the Puritans represented. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The crucial point is that the Reformation created a fracture within Christianity, not merely over doctrine, but over how to live faith, and Christmas became a symbolic battlefield. Was it possible to be a devout Christian and still reject Christmas? Apparently, yes. And that possibility that such a central festival could be seen as optional or even harmful permanently changed the relationship between Christianity and its inherited traditions. In colonial America, these European divisions were transplanted and sometimes intensified. The Pilgrims who arrived in Massachusetts were strict Puritans. For them, Christmas was an abomination. Historical records show that on the first Christmas after they landed, 1620, the Pilgrims deliberately worked, building their cabins, sending a clear message. This day has no special significance. When some later colonists, coming from Anglican traditions that maintained Christmas, attempted to celebrate, they were rebuked. In 1659, Massachusetts passed a law making it illegal to celebrate Christmas, with fines for offenders. The law remained officially in force until 1681. Even after its repeal, the anti-Christmas culture persisted in New England for generations. Christmas did not become a federal holiday in the United States until 1870, partly because large segments of the population, especially in the North, still viewed it with Puritan suspicion. Meanwhile, in Catholic regions, southern Germany, Austria, Italy, Spain, Latin America, Christmas continued with increasing elaboration, almost in defiant reaction to Protestantism. The Catholic Counter-Reformation, the movement to renew and defend Catholicism against Protestant criticism, invested heavily in spectacular art and ritual. Christmas masses became extravagant productions with full orchestras. Catholic composers created some of the most beautiful Christmas music. Adeste Fideles, O Come All Ye Faithful, elaborate Christmas masses. Nativity scenes became increasingly elaborate, especially in Naples, where craftsmen created extraordinarily detailed miniature figures, not merely the traditional figures, but entire scenes of Neapolitan life, with bakers, fishermen, musicians, all witnessing the birth. It was a form of art and also a theological statement. Christ's incarnation happened in the real world, among real people, and all are invited to witness. It was, not coincidentally, precisely the kind of material elaboration that Protestants criticized as distraction from the pure spiritual message. This Catholic-Protestant division over Christmas created radically different Christmas experiences in Europe and the Americas. If you were born in Catholic Munich, Christmas would be the central festival of your life, with weeks of preparation, special markets, glorious masses. If you were born in Calvinist Edinburgh, December 25th would be just another cold working day. And these differences reinforced sectarian identities. Christmas became a marker of who you were, not merely religiously, but ethnically and politically. Celebrating Christmas in a particular way signaled your loyalty to one tradition and rejection of another. Does that sound familiar? Today we still see culture wars around Christmas. Debates about saying Merry Christmas versus Happy Holidays, about nativity scenes on public property, about whether Christmas is a religious or secular holiday. These modern controversies have deep roots in these divisions from 500 years ago. What do we learn from this turbulent period? That traditions that seem permanent and essential are actually contingent and contestable. That sincerely religious people can fundamentally disagree about how to express their faith. That rituals are powerful precisely because they carry multiple meanings. And when those meanings conflict, the ritual becomes a battlefield. The Reformation did not destroy Christmas but permanently transformed it into something disputed, something that could no longer be accepted without question. And perhaps paradoxically, by surviving this existential crisis, Christmas would eventually emerge stronger, more diverse, more adaptable. But that adaptability would come from unexpected places, not from theological disputes, but from the cultural changes that modernity would bring. And those changes were only beginning to unfold. The 18th century brought winds of change that would blow across all European institutions, including the Church and its traditions. The Enlightenment, an intellectual movement that emphasized reason, science, skepticism toward traditional authority and belief in human progress, fundamentally questioned the role of religion in public and private life. Philosophers like Voltaire openly mocked religious dogmas. David Hume argued that miracles were impossible by definition. The French Encyclopedia, a monumental project to compile all human knowledge, treated Christianity as a historical and anthropological phenomenon, not as revealed truth. In this intellectual context, what happened to Christmas? Surprisingly, rather than disappearing under rationalist attack, Christmas began a fascinating transformation, from a primarily religious celebration to a cultural festival with expanded meanings. How does a religious tradition survive when religion itself is questioned? The answer lay in finding new meanings, new justifications, new forms of relevance. In Georgian and later Victorian England, Christmas began to be reimagined, not merely as religious commemoration, but as a celebration of family, generosity, and social unity. There were practical reasons for this. The Industrial Revolution was radically transforming British society. People migrated en masse from rural areas to cities, working in factories under brutal conditions. Families were separated, traditional communities crumbled, economic inequality deepened dramatically. Christmas offered a moment of pause in this whirlwind, an opportunity to reconnect with family, practice charity, assert human values against the dehumanization of industrialization. It was not necessarily about theology, it was about humanity. Can you see how this allowed Christmas to appeal even to those who were religiously skeptical? One did not need to believe in the divinity of Christ to value a day dedicated to family and generosity. Charles Dickens, mentioned earlier, played an absolutely crucial role in this transformation. A Christmas Carol, published in 1843, became an instant cultural phenomenon. The story of Ebenezer Scrooge, a miser transformed into a philanthropist after visits from ghosts on Christmas Eve, captured the public imagination in an extraordinary way. But note what the story emphasizes. There are no church scenes or theological sermons. Dickens's Christmas is about social responsibility, about the wealthy recognizing their obligation to the poor, about family gathered around the table, about children, especially Tiny Tim, the crippled son of the employee Bob Cratchit, deserving a chance to flourish. There was religion there. The Cratchit family goes to church, and there are invocations of divine blessing, but it is not the center. The center is ethical and emotional. How should we live together? How should we treat the vulnerable? Dickens was secularizing Christmas, making it accessible to audiences who perhaps did not attend church regularly, but who recognized the importance of the values it promoted. This version of Christmas spread rapidly, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world. Prince Albert, the German husband of Queen Victoria, introduced to the British court the German tradition of the decorated Christmas tree. When images of the royal family around their Christmas tree were published in the popular press in 1848, the fashion exploded. Suddenly, middle-class families throughout England wanted their own trees. The Christmas tree was not particularly religious in symbolism. It was festive decoration, a sign of domestic prosperity, a visual center for family gathering. Gifts began to be exchanged under the tree, transforming Christmas also into a festival of consumption. Stores aggressively marketed perfect Christmas gifts. Christmas cards, made possible by new, cheap printing technologies, became a means of maintaining social connections, sent by the thousands. Christmas was becoming an industry, not merely a religious celebration. In the United States, similar processes occurred, but with their own dynamics. As mentioned, Christmas was not widely celebrated in the Puritan colonies of the North, but immigrants from other traditions, Germans, Dutch, Irish Catholics, brought their Christmas customs. In Dutch New York, formerly New Amsterdam, the figure of Sinterklaas was gradually Americanized into Santa Claus. In 1823, the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, better known as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, created the modern image of Santa Claus, jolly, rotund, traveling in a sleigh pulled by reindeer, descending chimneys to deliver gifts. This figure was completely secular. There is nothing particularly religious about Santa Claus. He is a magical, folkloric figure associated with generosity and childhood joy. Later, Coca-Cola and other advertisers would refine his visual image, the red and white suit, transforming him into a global commercial icon. This commercialization of Christmas was received with ambivalence from the start. There were those who saw commerce as corrupting the true essence of Christmas, transforming it into an orgy of materialism. Others argued pragmatically that gifts were concrete expressions of love and consideration, that sustaining local commerce was a positive communal act. This tension between spiritual Christmas and commercial Christmas would become a permanent theme. Already by the late 19th century, there were complaints that the true meaning of Christmas was being lost. Does that sound familiar? Every generation since has had its version of this lamentation. What is fascinating is that commercialization, far from destroying Christmas, seems to have strengthened it by expanding its cultural relevance beyond practicing religionists. Even atheists and agnostics could participate in Christmas as a secular winter festival, celebrating humanist values without necessarily endorsing Christian metaphysics. Musically, this period saw an explosion of new Christmas songs that reflected this duality. Traditional religious hymns continued. Silent Night, Stille Nacht, was composed in 1818 in Austria and spread globally. But new secular songs also proliferated. Jingle Bells, 1857, mentions neither Christ nor Christianity. It is merely about the joy of snow sleighs. We Wish You a Merry Christmas is about well wishes and plum pudding. These songs coexisted, creating a mixed Christmas soundtrack where sacred and secular intertwined without apparent tension. At family gatherings one could sing, "O come all ye faithful," and shortly after, "Deck the halls," alternating between Christian worship and cultural festivity without feeling contradiction. But what about the churches? How did they react to this secularization? In varied ways. Some embraced it, seeing opportunity. If Christmas was becoming culturally important, this gave the church a platform to reach people who did not attend regularly. Special Christmas services could attract crowds, offering a moment of evangelization. Other churches resisted, insisting that Christmas should remain strictly religious, rejecting trees, gifts, and Santa Claus as pagan distractions. This division often followed denominational lines. Catholics and Anglicans tended to be more accommodating, integrating cultural elements. Conservative Protestants, especially those of Calvinist heritage, were more resistant. But increasingly, culture shaped religious practice as much as the reverse. Churches that wanted to remain relevant needed to negotiate with their members' cultural expectations, which had absorbed the Dickensian Christmas from popular media. The 19th century also saw Christmas spread globally through European colonial empires. Christian missionaries brought not merely the gospel, but also Christmas traditions to Africa, Asia, Oceania, and Latin America. This created fascinating cultural encounters. In some places, local populations adopted Christmas enthusiastically, but transformed it with elements of their own cultures. In Ethiopia, Orthodox Christians celebrated Ganna on January 7th, with traditional games and white garments. In Mexico, Las Posadas recreated Mary and Joseph's search for lodging through 9 nights of processions. In India, Christians decorated mango trees instead of pines. Christmas was becoming truly global, but in the process it was multiplying into multiple culturally specific versions. There were also those who simply rejected Christmas completely for secular reasons. Socialists and communists saw Christmas as the opium of the people, a tool of religious control that distracted workers from their exploitation. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Soviet regime attempted to replace Christmas with winter solstice celebration, or New Year tree festival, maintaining festive elements, tree, gifts, the figure of Grandfather Frost, but removing religious content. It worked partially. Generations of Soviets grew up without religious Christmas, but with secular winter festive traditions that were formally secular but structurally similar. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a resurgence of traditional Orthodox Christmas, but mixed with the Soviet secular traditions that had become familiar. It was a fascinating cultural hybrid. What we see emerging from the Enlightenment and 19th century is an extraordinarily malleable Christmas, capable of being multiple things for multiple people. Profound religious celebration for the devout, family festival for the middle class, commercial opportunity for merchants, moment of charity for social reformers, national cultural tradition, even secular winter celebration for the non-religious. This multiplicity is key to Christmas's survival and prosperity. By becoming more than merely a religious festival, by expanding its meanings, Christmas became more resistant to criticism from any specific angle. You could reject Christian theology and still value Christmas family gatherings. You could be a devout Christian and still enjoy secular aspects like decorations and gifts. Christmas had become a total cultural phenomenon, greater than any one of its constituent parts. And this transformation was only beginning. The 20th century would bring even more dramatic changes, but ones that would follow patterns established in this crucial period of secularization and reimagination. If you are enjoying this journey through the flavors and stories of Christmas across the centuries, give this video a thumbs up. Every like shows us that this content is resonating with you and motivates us to bring more fascinating stories. And if you have not yet subscribed to Sleeping Times, this is the perfect moment. We have many other historical journeys waiting for you. What period of history would you like to explore with us next? Leave your suggestion in the comments. Now let us continue our journey, and we still have much ground ahead. The 20th century began with industrial optimism and technological progress, but quickly plunged into the unprecedented horror of the First World War. Between 1914 and 1918, millions of young men were sent to muddy trenches that stretched for hundreds of kilometers across Europe. There, in unimaginably brutal conditions, mud up to the knees, rats the size of cats, poisonous gases, constant artillery, the ever-present threat of sudden death, these soldiers faced not merely the enemy, but the loss of any semblance of human normalcy. And then came Christmas 1914, and something extraordinary happened, something that would reveal both the persistence of our humanity and the tragedy of its systematic suppression by the machinery of war. How do you celebrate the birth of the Prince of Peace when you are living in the hell on earth, when your mission is to kill other human beings? Christmas on the Western Front would answer that question in unforgettable ways. On December 24, 1914, along several points of the Western Front, German soldiers began to decorate their trenches. Small trees were erected. Some soldiers had received Tannenbaums, Christmas trees, sent from Germany. Candles were lit and placed along the parapets of the trenches. And then, in the freezing darkness of Christmas Eve, German voices began to sing Stille Nacht, Silent Night. On the other side of no man's land, British and French soldiers, initially on alert thinking it might be a trick, slowly recognized the melody. And something remarkable happened. They began to sing along, some in English, Silent Night, others attempting the words in German. The music transcended language, transcended enmity. For a few minutes, they were not enemies, they were merely men far from home at Christmas, sharing a song that everyone had known since childhood. What began with songs evolved into something far more extraordinary. At multiple points along the front, soldiers from both sides began to emerge from their trenches, not with weapons, but with hands raised, walking cautiously through no man's land, that devastated space between the trenches, normally a zone of certain death. They met in the middle. They shook hands. They exchanged small gifts, chocolate, cigarettes, uniform buttons as souvenirs. They conversed in broken English or fragmented German, or simply through gestures and smiles. Some played football using helmets as goal markers, the famous football match of the Christmas truce, immortalized in later films and songs. Others simply walked together, showing photographs of families, sharing stories of home. For a few hours, in some places for days, the war stopped not by command of generals, but by spontaneous agreement of common soldiers who chose to remember their shared humanity. But perhaps the most touching and macabre aspect of the Christmas truce was what many soldiers did together. They buried the dead. No man's land was filled with bodies, men killed in earlier assaults who had been left rotting where they fell, because retrieving them meant almost certain death. During the truce, soldiers from both sides worked together to dig graves, identify bodies when possible, and bury them with some dignity. Enemies who days before had tried to kill each other now conducted joint funeral services. German and British chaplains prayed over the same graves. Men wept not only for their own comrades, but for the enemy too, recognizing them as someone's father, brother, son. It was a moment of raw humanity amid the most total dehumanization. How do you process that? How do you return to trying to kill these same people with whom you just shared the most human moment? That is precisely the question that haunted many soldiers after the truce. Military commands on both sides were horrified when they learned what had happened. Strict orders were issued. This could not happen again. Fraternizing with the enemy was treason. Officers threatened court-martial, but the damage, or would it be the healing, was already done. Many soldiers who participated in the Christmas truce found it impossible to resume war with the same unthinking ferocity. They had seen the face of the enemy and recognized a human being. Reports from soldiers' letters after the truce show profound psychological conflict. How can I shoot at him now that I know he has 3 children, just like me? The efficiency of modern war depends on dehumanization, transforming the enemy into a target, into an abstract concept, not a person. Christmas, for a few hours, undid that dehumanization, and the military machine had to work hard to rebuild it. The Christmas truce of 1914 did not repeat on a similar scale in the subsequent years of the war. By 1915, military commands were prepared and took measures to prevent it. Bombardments were specifically scheduled for Christmas Eve to keep animosity high. Soldiers who had participated in the 1914 truce were deliberately transferred. But smaller and more discreet Christmas celebrations still happened in the trenches. Soldiers created improvised decorations from whatever materials were available. Special rations were distributed when possible, a bit of canned Christmas pudding, perhaps a small ration of rum. Letters and packages from home were desperately awaited. Field religious services were held, often in absurd conditions, a chaplain preaching in a muddy trench while artillery rumbled in the distance, men standing with rifles ready in case of attack. The contrast between the Christmas message, peace on earth, goodwill among men, and the surrounding reality could not be more acute. For soldiers individually, Christmas in the trenches often provoked unbearable homesickness. Letters written during this period are heartbreaking. Men describe trying to imagine their families gathered around the tree, children opening presents, warm dinners, all while they were in frozen holes, covered in mud, eating cold rations. Some could not bear it. Desertion rates increased slightly around Christmas, and cases of self-mutilation, shooting oneself in the foot, for example, to get medical evacuation, also rose. It was not cowardice, it was understandable human despair. Christmas made the war not more bearable through comfort, but less bearable through contrast, reminding men of what they had lost, of what they might never have again if they died there. On the home front, Christmas during the World Wars also changed dramatically. Rationing meant that traditional celebrations were impossible. In the United Kingdom during the Second World War, families received ration books allowing minuscule amounts of sugar, butter, meat. Creating a festive Christmas dinner required desperate creativity. turkeys replaced by rabbits or even molded vegetables, puddings made with substitutes that would never taste like the real thing. The British government issued pamphlets with wartime Christmas recipes, teaching housewives to make the most with the least. Gifts were often handmade because manufactured products were scarce. Hand-carved wooden toys, clothes sewn from recycled fabric, used books rewrapped, became Christmas gifts. There was dignity and love in this economy of scarcity, but also real deprivation. Children during the wars experienced particularly complicated Christmases. In the United Kingdom, hundreds of thousands of children were evacuated from cities to the countryside to protect them from bombing. This meant Christmases away from parents, living with strangers. Special radio programs were broadcast on Christmas morning, with recorded messages from parents to evacuated children trying to maintain connection through radio waves. It was heartbreaking and necessary at the same time. In the United States, with fathers and older brothers serving overseas, Christmas had painful absences. Trees were decorated with blue stars representing family members in service, or gold stars, signifying they would not return. Imagining these trees with their silent stars reminds us that celebration and mourning often coexist. Curiously, despite, or perhaps because of, the horror, Christmas celebrations during the wars also showed extraordinary resilience and human creativity. In prisoner of war camps, captured soldiers organized elaborate Christmas celebrations with practically nothing. Decorations made from salvaged wrapping paper, improvised trees from found branches, theatrical and musical performances created and rehearsed in secret. One famous account from a German POW camp describes British prisoners mounting a complete production of Dickens's A Christmas Carol, with costumes created from blankets and bags for an audience of hundreds of prisoners and even some guards. For a few hours they transcended their imprisonment through shared art and ritual. It was psychological resistance, a refusal to allow external circumstances to completely destroy their humanity and culture. Christmas during the World Wars also saw propaganda from all sides. Governments used Christmas imagery to motivate war efforts. "Bring our boys home for Christmas" was a recurring slogan. Posters showed idealized families celebrating Christmas safely, with text suggesting that protecting this way of life required military sacrifice. It was effective emotional manipulation connecting the private and domestic, Christmas with family, to the public and political, national war. Enemy nations even used Christmas for psychological warfare. Germans sometimes broadcast Christmas music through loudspeakers directed at enemy trenches, trying to induce homesickness and undermine morale. What does Christmas in wartime reveal about the celebration itself? That it is remarkably resilient, that it persists even in the most unlikely circumstances because it serves deep human needs that become even more urgent under pressure. The need for connection, for family ritual, for moments of beauty and meaning amid chaos and horror. But it also reveals inherent tensions. Christmas proclaims peace while celebrated amid war. It proclaims universal generosity while nations try to destroy each other. These contradictions were not resolved, merely lived, with all the discomfort and confusion that implied. And for those who survived the wars and returned, Christmas would never be quite the same. It would always carry memories of Christmases celebrated in impossible conditions, of friends who did not return, of a cultural innocence lost. But life continued, Christmas continued, and new challenges and transformations awaited in the second half of this tumultuous century. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the Western world plunged into a period of unprecedented prosperity, especially in the United States. The economy was growing, suburbanization was exploding, and a new technology was beginning to dominate homes: television. In 1950, only 9% of American homes owned a TV. By 1960, it was 87%. This small, glowing box in the living room would fundamentally transform not merely how people consumed entertainment, but how they celebrated Christmas. For the first time in history, millions of people in different cities, states, and eventually countries experience Christmas through the same images, programs, and commercials broadcast simultaneously into their homes. Christmas was becoming standardized, mediatized, globalized in ways that no church or government had managed. How did this technology shape our understanding of what Christmas should be? And what did we gain and lose when shared celebrations were mediated by screens? Christmas TV specials became cultural institutions almost instantly. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer premiered in 1964 and became a mandatory annual event for American families. A Charlie Brown Christmas, 1965, offered a slightly countercultural message within mainstream commercialism. Charlie Brown openly questions the commercialization of Christmas before Linus recites the Luke nativity narrative directly, recentering the celebration on its religious meaning. How the Grinch Stole Christmas, 1966, presented a similar critique of materialism. Curiously, even these programs that criticized commercialism were sponsored by corporations selling products. It was self-conscious contradiction that the public seemed to accept. We could watch Charlie Brown lament commercialization during commercial breaks selling Charlie Brown toys, and somehow it worked. These specials created shared cultural vocabulary. Children across the United States, and eventually internationally, when the programs were exported, grew up with the same references. Rudolph's bright red nose, Charlie Brown's pathetic tree, transformed by love and community, the Grinch's heart, growing 3 sizes. These stories, broadcast annually, became as traditional as folk tales passed down orally through generations, except that now, tradition was only decades old, not centuries, and was corporate in origin, not communal. But did this diminish their meaning for those who loved them? Children who eagerly awaited these specials each year were not less emotionally invested than medieval children awaiting mystery plays in their villages. The difference lay in the medium and control. TV was one-directional, not participatory, and its content was determined by network executives in New York and Los Angeles, not by local communities. Television also radically transformed Christmas advertising. Before TV, advertisements were static, printed in newspapers and magazines, or spoken on radio. TV allowed emotional visual narratives of 30 or 60 seconds that could create powerful associations between products and Christmas feelings. Commercials showed idealized families gathered around products, a Polaroid camera capturing magical moments, an electric train circling under the tree, perfume made synonymous with romance. Brands worked to insert themselves into Christmas traditions. Coca-Cola had already solidified its association with Santa Claus. Now countless other brands sought to become essential to the perfect Christmas. And it worked spectacularly. Spending on Christmas gifts exploded in the post-war decades. The commercial Christmas that Dickens and others had initiated in the 19th century reached its full maturity in the TV era. But television did not merely sell products, it sold a specific vision of how Christmas should be. The programs and commercials predominantly featured white, middle-class suburban families in perfectly decorated homes with abundant gifts under impeccable trees. This normative image excluded vast portions of the population, poor people, racial minorities, non-traditional families, creating psychological pressure. If your Christmas did not look like the one on TV, you were doing it wrong, you were failing. This generated anxiety and inadequacy that manufacturers and retailers exploited by offering products that promised to bring you closer to the televised ideal. It was a self-feeding cycle. Media created impossible expectations, and the market sold solutions to the anxiety those expectations generated. Internationally, television and later film and music exported American Christmas to the world. Countries without significant Christian tradition began adopting elements of cultural Christmas through American media. In Japan, Christmas is not a religious holiday. Christians are less than 2% of the population, but it became a popular secular celebration, complete with trees, gifts, and curiously, fried chicken dinners from KFC, the result of brilliant marketing campaigns in the 1970s that convinced Japanese people that Americans eat KFC at Christmas. It is completely fabricated, but became tradition in a generation. Christmas was being globalized, but in the specific version created by the American entertainment and advertising industry, not necessarily in the religious or culturally diverse forms that existed in different Christian contexts. Christmas music was also transformed by the recording industry and TV. Popular singers released Christmas albums that became massive commercial successes. Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, Elvis Presley, Andy Williams. Bing Crosby's White Christmas became the best-selling single of all time. TV variety shows featured Christmas specials where stars sang Christmas songs. These recorded performances gradually replaced community singing in many homes. Why sing off-key with family when you could listen to perfectly produced Sinatra? There was a gain in quality, but a loss in participation. Christmas was becoming more of a spectacle to be consumed than a ritual to be actively practiced. Churches reacted in varied ways to these changes. Some tried to compete, installing projection screens, creating elaborate Broadway-style Christmas productions, using corporate marketing techniques to attract members. Others doubled down in the opposite direction, emphasizing simplicity, liturgical tradition, old-fashioned Christmas as an antidote to modern commercial frenzy. Christmas sermons frequently lamented the loss of true meaning, criticizing materialism and superficiality. But there was something ironic about this. Many of these same churches filled only at Christmas and Easter with cultural Christians, people who came more from family tradition and social expectation than from deep religious commitment. Christmas had become so culturally dominant that attending church at Christmas was simply what one does, partially emptied of genuine religious content for many participants. Sociologically, television helped create what some academics call civil religion, a set of shared rituals and symbols that unite a nation, but that is more cultural than theologically specific. American Christmas in the TV era functioned this way. Almost everyone participated, but what exactly they were celebrating varied enormously. For some, it was the birth of Christ. For others, family values and generosity. For still others, merely a winter festival and gift exchange. But everyone watched the same TV specials, heard the same songs, shopped in the same stores. There was cultural cohesion without necessarily religious cohesion. Was this impoverishment or democratization, loss of theological depth or gain in inclusivity? The answer depended, and still depends, on whom you ask and what you value. As decades passed and TV evolved, from 3 networks to dozens of cable channels, then to on-demand streaming, Christmas on screen fragmented but also intensified. Entire channels dedicated themselves to 24/7 Christmas programming during December. Hallmark Channel created an entire genre of Christmas romance movies, producing dozens annually with predictable but comforting formulas. Big city woman returns to small hometown, reconnects with childhood love, or meets charming man, rediscovers the true meaning of Christmas, lives happily ever after. These movies are criticized for being superficial, but their massive popularity suggests they meet some need: escapism, comfort, the certainty of a happy ending in an uncertain world. They are modern fairy tales, as formulaic as medieval parables, but wrapped in contemporary aesthetics. What does the television era teach us about Christmas? That mass media has extraordinary power to shape culture, create traditions practically from scratch, and standardize experiences across vast populations. But also that people bring their own meanings to these shared experiences. 2 families can watch the same Christmas special, but one sees secular entertainment while the other sees a religious message. The media offers the text, but audiences create the meanings. And as we move beyond the era of unified TV to the fragmented digital era, where each person can curate their own personalized Christmas content, we will see whether the cultural cohesion that TV created can be maintained, or whether we are entering an era of individualized Christmases, infinitely diverse, but perhaps more isolated. This digital era, with its unique challenges and possibilities, was only beginning to unfold as the 20th century ended and a new millennium dawned. As the 20th century advanced and the 21st century began, something remarkable was happening. Christmas, born in Mediterranean and European Christian traditions, was becoming truly global, but not in a uniform or one-directional way. While elements of Western Christmas spread through globalization and media, cultures around the world did not simply adopt them passively. They transformed them, mixed them with local traditions, created unique syntheses. Simultaneously, waves of immigration brought non-Western Christmas traditions to Europe and America, diversifying what Christmas could mean even in these traditional centers. The result is a global mosaic of Christmas celebrations that defies any simple narrative. How does a celebration maintain a recognizable identity while adapting to radically different cultural contexts? And what happens when multiple versions of Christmas coexist in the same space? In the Philippines, the only predominantly Catholic nation in Asia due to centuries of Spanish colonization, Christmas is celebrated with extraordinary intensity. The season begins in September. Burr months, Filipinos joke, September, October, November, December, making it possibly the longest Christmas celebration in the world. The Simbang Gabi, midnight masses held in the 9 days before Christmas, fill churches at 4 a.m. with faithful who often walk through pre-dawn darkness. After Mass, street vendors sell bibingka, rice cake, and puto bumbong, purple steamed rice, foods specifically associated with this season. Giant paper lanterns called paroles, often elaborate and electrically illuminated, decorate houses and streets, symbolizing the Star of Bethlehem. Filipino Christmas is profoundly religious and profoundly festive simultaneously, without apparent tension between these aspects. In Ethiopia, Orthodox Christians celebrate Ganna on January the 7th, due to the Julian calendar that the Ethiopian Church still uses. Preparation includes a 43-day fast where the faithful avoid animal products, no meat, dairy, or eggs. The day of Ganna itself involves religious services that can last hours, with people often standing the entire time in rock-hewn churches that are centuries old. After the service, the fast is broken with doro wat, a spicy chicken stew. A traditional game also called Ganna, similar to field hockey, is played by young people. It is a Christmas completely different from the Western one in aesthetics and practice, but connected by the shared narrative of Christ's birth. Comparing Ethiopian Ganna to American Christmas in shopping centers is witnessing how the same religious story can generate radically divergent cultural expressions. In Latin America, Christmas traditions combine European Catholic heritage with indigenous and African elements, creating unique syntheses. In Mexico, Las Posadas are 9-night processions before Christmas, recreating Mary and Joseph's search for shelter. Participants go from house to house, singing, being repeatedly rejected, until finally being invited inside for celebration with food, drinks, and piñata breaking. It is participatory community theater that transforms entire neighborhoods into a living stage for the nativity narrative. The Misa de Gallo, Rooster Mass, at midnight on December 24th fills churches to overflowing. Afterward, families feast with tamales, ponche, hot fruit drink, and buñuelos. Gifts are often opened not on the 25th but on January the 6th on the Day of the Magi, reflecting the Spanish emphasis on this aspect of the Christmas story. In India, Christians represent only 2 to 3% of the population, But in states like Kerala and Goa, with larger Christian concentrations, Christmas is celebrated vibrantly. Homes are decorated with paper stars, often five-pointed and illuminated from within. Churches hold special masses, often incorporating classical Carnatic Indian music and other local cultural elements. Kuswa, a variety of traditional sweets and savories, is prepared and shared among neighbors of all religions. Curiously, even in areas with few Christians, elements of secular Christmas have penetrated. Decorative trees in shopping centers, Santa Claus in stores, Christmas music playing. Is it cultural appropriation or appreciative celebration? Opinions vary, but the phenomenon illustrates how Christmas symbols can circulate beyond their original religious contexts. In Japan, mentioned earlier, Christmas became a fascinating cultural curiosity. Not being an official holiday or significant religious tradition, it was reimagined as a romantic and commercial festival. Young couples celebrate with romantic dinners. Restaurants become crowded and expensive on December 24th. Christmas cakes, usually white cake decorated with strawberries, are sold in practically every bakery and consumed on December 25th. And yes, Kentucky Fried Chicken managed to convince generations of Japanese people that fried chicken is traditional Christmas food, with families ordering weeks in advance. It is Christmas completely disconnected from religious meaning, but integrated into the cultural calendar through sheer commercial force and creative adaptation. It shows that Christmas can be adopted purely as a secular festival, retaining some symbols, trees, gifts, Santa Claus, while completely abandoning Christian content. But globalization is not merely a story of Western diffusion, it is also a story of diaspora. Immigrant communities bring their Christmas traditions to new countries, creating hybrid celebrations. Filipinos in Los Angeles celebrate Simbang Gabi in local churches, adapting the tradition to the new context but maintaining its essence. Ethiopians in Washington, D.C. hold Ghana celebrations, introducing American neighbors to Eastern Orthodox traditions. Mexicans throughout the United States maintain Las Posadas, sometimes inviting non-Latinos to participate, becoming a means of sharing culture and building community bridges. These diasporic celebrations serve a dual function. They connect immigrants to their cultures of origin, providing continuity and identity, while also enriching the host country's culture with new diversity. This diversity, however, also generates tensions. In increasingly multicultural and secular societies, debates arise about how, or whether, to celebrate Christmas in public spaces. Is it appropriate to have nativity scenes on government property in constitutionally secular countries? Should public schools hold Christmas concerts or more generically inclusive winter festival celebrations? Should store employees say Merry Christmas or more neutral Happy Holidays? These Christmas culture wars reflect deeper anxieties about national identity, cultural heritage, and the place of religion in public life. For some, any departure from traditional Christmas celebrations represents loss of cultural identity. For others, insisting on dominant Christmas in pluralistic societies is exclusion of non-Christians. Social media and the internet added a new dimension to these dynamics. Now, a family in Ghana can watch American Christmas videos on YouTube, while Americans watch Ethiopian Ghana ceremonies. Christmas recipes circulate globally. Someone in Tokyo can make English pudding following an online tutorial. This allows unprecedented intercultural appreciation, but can also lead to confused pastiche, where symbols are ripped from context without understanding their meanings. A Chinese entrepreneur might wear Santa Claus clothing for a sales promotion without any idea of St. Nicholas or any Christian context. Is it trivialization or simply pragmatic adaptation of symbols for new uses? International Christian organizations attempt to navigate these complexities. Missionaries no longer simply export Western Christmas. There is growing recognition of the importance of indigenization or inculturation. allowing Christian expressions to emerge organically from local cultures. So churches in Africa can celebrate Christmas with traditional African drums and dances. Christian communities in India can use classical raga melodies for Christmas hymns. This approach respects the universality of the Christian message while honoring cultural particularity. But there are tensions. More conservative religious leaders sometimes see these adaptations as dilution of true faith, while reformers see them as essential for relevance and respect. There is also the growing phenomenon of non-Christians celebrating secular versions of Christmas in their own cultures. In China, where Christianity is a minority and the government is officially atheist, commercial Christmas has exploded in popularity, especially among urban youth. Christmas trees decorate shopping centers, Christmas music plays, gifts are exchanged, all without religious context. It is purely a festival of consumption and borrowed aesthetics. For Western businesses, it is a lucrative market opportunity, but it raises questions. What happens when religious symbols become global commodities completely separated from their original meanings? Do they lose something essential or simply demonstrate cultural adaptability? The globalized Christmas of the 21st century is therefore simultaneously more universal and more fragmented than ever. More people around the world are aware of Christmas and participate in some form of its celebration. But what exactly they are celebrating varies enormously. The birth of Christ, family values, a winter festival, a commercial opportunity, a moment of romance, or simply inherited cultural tradition. There is no longer one Christmas, but Christmases, plural, diverse, often contradictory. And perhaps this is inevitable in a globalized and connected world. The question is no longer what is true Christmas, but how do these multiple versions coexist, interact, and occasionally enrich one another? The answer is unfolding in real time, in millions of homes, churches, stores, and screens around the world, as each culture and individual negotiates what Christmas means to them. And in this ongoing negotiation, new challenges and opportunities emerge, especially as digital technology fundamentally transforms how we connect and celebrate. The 21st century brought technological transformation that rivals the invention of the printing press, the internet, smartphones, social media, on-demand entertainment platforms, artificial intelligence. These technologies fundamentally changed how we communicate, work, shop, and relate to one another, and inevitably they transformed how we celebrate Christmas. For the first time in history, it is possible to participate in Christmas celebrations without being physically present, to connect with hundreds of people simultaneously through digital messages, and to curate experiences of Christmas completely personalized. But these possibilities bring unsettling paradoxes. We are more connected, yet often feel more alone. We have access to infinite options, but many report that Christmas seems less special, less meaningful. How is digital technology reshaping Christmas, and what are we gaining and losing in this process? Christmas shopping has been completely transformed by e-commerce. Online retail giants have grown exponentially, and Christmas is their most lucrative season. It is now possible to buy all your Christmas gifts without leaving home, without interacting with another human being beyond the delivery person who leaves packages at the door. Algorithms suggest gifts based on browsing history. Wish lists are shared digitally through links. Deliveries are tracked in real time through apps. It is incredibly convenient. You can instantly compare prices, read reviews from other shoppers, find exactly what you are looking for in minutes. But something is lost. That experience of walking through decorated stores, smelling cinnamon and pine mixed in the air, the chance of unexpectedly finding the perfect gift, human interactions, even the frustrating ones with salespeople and other shoppers. Cities still decorate streets and encourage in-person shopping, but each year more people opt for the algorithmic efficiency of online shopping. Christmas shopping is becoming a solitary activity rather than a social one. Social media added a completely new dimension to Christmas. Platforms where we share photographs and videos became stages where Christmas is performed as much as lived. Families post carefully curated images of their trees, gifts, dinners, and gatherings. These photographs present idealized Christmases that generate inevitable comparisons. Why does their Christmas seem more magical than mine? Why do they have more gifts, more elaborate decorations, a happier family? Psychological research shows that intensive use of these platforms during holidays is correlated with increased anxiety, depression, and feelings of inadequacy. We are performing Christmas for invisible audiences rather than fully living it in the present moment. And there is pressure for everything to be perfect for the cameras, worthy of being photographed and shared, transforming intimate experiences into public content that seeks approval through likes and comments. But these same platforms also offer genuine connections, especially for those separated geographically from loved ones. Video calls allow grandparents to see grandchildren opening gifts in real time, even from different continents. Dispersed families can create message groups where they share moments of Christmas Day instantly. Immigrants maintain living connection with traditions and people in their countries of origin through video calls during celebrations. For people separated from their families for various reasons, online communities offer belonging and alternative Christmas celebrations. Technology proved to be both problem and solution, capable of connecting and isolating simultaneously, depending on how we use it. Christmas entertainment was revolutionized by streaming platforms. We are no longer limited to the programs that television broadcasters decide to air at specific times. Enormous digital libraries of Christmas movies and specials are available on demand anytime. We can watch Christmas classics at 3 in the morning if we want, or discover productions from other countries that would never be broadcast on our local television. But this abundance has a hidden cost. The shared experience of millions of people watching the same program simultaneously is disappearing. When only a few television networks existed, a Christmas special could be a unifying cultural experience. The next day, co-workers and neighbors talked about what they had watched together. Now, with infinite options, each family, each individual, can curate their own completely personalized Christmas entertainment. We gained absolute choice, but lost that sense of participating in something larger than ourselves, that shared cultural vocabulary. Christmas music was also transformed by audio streaming services. It is possible to create personalized playlists with exactly the Christmas songs you like, eliminating those you find annoying. Algorithms generate playlists based on your historical preferences. You can listen to medieval Christmas, jazz Christmas, rock Christmas, Christmas of any era or specific style imaginable. The variety is impressive. Musical traditions from dozens of countries available instantly. But curiously, some research suggests that this hyper-personalization may reduce pleasure. Part of the Christmas music experience was its omnipresence. You heard it whether you wanted to or not in stores, restaurants, radios, and it created a collective atmosphere that signaled the season had arrived. When everyone curates their own private soundtracks through headphones, there is no longer a shared sound of Christmas, just infinite individual versions that never meet. But there is a growing dark side in the digital era: loneliness. Paradoxically, while we are more connected digitally than any previous generation, many report feeling more alone, especially during holidays like Christmas that emphasize family and community. For those who are genuinely alone, elderly people whose families live far away or have died, people without close family, those excluded for various personal or social reasons, the digital era can intensify loneliness rather than relieve it. Seeing social media feeds filled with apparently perfect celebrations when you are alone is a painful experience that previous generations did not face. Technology connects, but also distances. It allows instant communication across continents, but often superficial communication that does not satisfy deeper human needs. There is no complete digital substitute for physical hugs, for the body warmth of loved ones gathered around the same table, for the small non-verbal interactions, a glance, a touch, a shared laugh, that communicate belonging in ways no video call can completely replicate. There are also profound questions about authenticity and meaning. When celebrations are mediated by screens, recorded, edited, shared for public consumption, they naturally change in their essence. There is self-consciousness that did not exist when moments were simply lived without constant documentation. Children opening gifts are now often instructed to pause, look at the camera, smile again to capture the perfect angle. Christmas dinner is photographed extensively before being eaten, often cooling in the process. The uncomfortable question emerges: are we really present in the celebrations, or are we observing them through our lenses, already thinking about how they will look when posted, what filters to use, what captions to write? Some movements and individuals are intentionally stepping back from these practices, establishing periods of digital fasting during holidays, creating family rules of no phones during dinner, intentionally valuing presence not mediated by devices. But these are minority reactions swimming against a much broader cultural tide that normalizes constant documentation. Artificial intelligence is now beginning to enter Christmas celebrations in ways that would have been science fiction just a decade ago. Voice-activated virtual assistants can play Christmas music on command, answer questions about recipes while you cook, even tell Christmas stories to children with surprisingly natural synthesized voices. Some homes have decorations controlled by apps, allowing you to change colors and patterns of Christmas lighting instantly through smartphones. Companies are experimenting with using artificial intelligence to generate personalized mass Christmas messages, analyzing relationship data to create texts that sound individualized but are algorithmically produced. There are even proposals to create Santa Claus experiences using computer-generated videos that can converse specifically with each child, using information collected about their behaviors and wishes throughout the year. It is technologically impressive and, to some, deeply disturbing. When magic is algorithmic, generated by code on remote servers rather than genuine human connection, does it maintain its power to enchant? When Santa Claus is a sophisticated bot programmed to simulate joy, is there authenticity in the experience? Economically, the digital era has massively expanded Christmas's commercial reach. Companies can now sell globally with relatively low entry costs. Sales events created in one country quickly become global phenomena, adopted in nations that have no original traditions they supposedly celebrate, purely as marketing strategies to start the Christmas shopping season earlier. The pressure to consume is omnipresent and escaping it is practically impossible. Targeted advertisements follow you across websites based on your browsing history. Remarketing strategies ensure that products you simply looked at appear repeatedly across multiple platforms. Algorithms optimize every visual and textual element to maximize the probability of purchase. It is an extraordinarily efficient sales machine, refined by years of testing and behavioral data from billions of users. But many consumers report feeling exhausted by this constant pressure, yearning for simpler versions of Christmas with less emphasis on material acquisition and more on experiences and human connections. Curiously, there are also counter-movements that use digital platforms themselves to promote alternative approaches. Online pages, video channels, and content creators dedicate themselves to promoting minimalist Christmas, sustainable Christmas, or experiential Christmas, focused on memories rather than material objects. They share ideas for homemade and handcrafted gifts, decorations made from recycled or natural materials, ways to celebrate that minimize environmental waste and unchecked consumption. Tutorials teach people to make at home things they would normally buy, from decorated cookies to elaborate wreaths. These movements use the very commercial digital tools they criticize to spread their anti-consumerist messages. It is a fascinating paradox. Platforms created fundamentally to facilitate commerce being used to promote moderation and even resistance to consumerism. And it demonstrates that technology is, ultimately, a tool. Its effects depend on the intentions and choices of those who use it. Educationally, digital resources have enabled preservation and dissemination of Christmas traditions that might otherwise disappear. Small communities can document their unique celebrations and share them with the world. Recipes passed down orally through generations are now recorded on video, preserved for future generations, even if local practices change. Traditional music from remote regions can be discovered by enthusiasts on the other side of the planet. There is democratization of cultural access that is genuinely positive, but simultaneously there is homogenization. Global influences can overwhelm local traditions when younger generations see apparently more exciting or modern celebrations from other cultures and wish to adopt them, abandoning practices from their own cultural heritage. Christmas in the digital era is, therefore, a study in profound contradictions. More connected, yet often more lonely. More options, but less shared cultural cohesion. More convenient, but often more stressful. More documented, but perhaps less fully lived in the present moment. We navigate these contradictions imperfectly and experimentally, trying to capture the real benefits of technology while minimizing psychological and social costs. And as we do so, Christmas continues to evolve rapidly, adapting to the realities of an increasingly digital and virtually connected world. But there are persistent questions that no technology can answer for us. What really matters at Christmas? Is it about accumulating things or cultivating connections? Performance for external audiences or genuine presence with those we love? Rigid maintenance of tradition or courageous openness to innovation? These fundamental questions have accompanied humanity through all eras and incarnations of Christmas, from Roman catacombs to medieval basilicas, from war trenches to television-filled living rooms, and now to the infinite digital spaces where we celebrate today. The digital era simply places them in a new technological context, sharpening some tensions while complicating others with layers of complexity previously unimaginable. And these questions lead us naturally to the present moment where all these stories converge and to the uncertain future still being written. Here we are in the first decades of the 21st century, celebrating Christmas in a world that Christians in the Roman catacombs could not have imagined even in their wildest dreams. And yet something remarkable persists. In millions of homes around the world, in dozens of languages and through countless cultural variations, people continue to mark this time of year as special, meaningful, worthy of celebration. Contemporary Christmas is an impossible collage of all the historical layers we have explored. There are elements of primitive catacombs in the theology some churches still preach. There are echoes of Constantinian basilicas in the cathedrals that still fill on Christmas Eve. There are resonances of medieval dramas in school plays. There is the tension of the Reformation in denominational divisions. There is Victorian sentimentalism in our cards. There are echoes of wartime in the stories veterans share. And there is digital omnipresence in how almost everything is now experienced and shared. How do all these layers coexist? And where is Christmas heading as we advance deeper into this turbulent century? Contemporary Christmas is fundamentally pluralistic. There is no longer one Christmas, but many Christmases coexisting, often overlapping, sometimes conflicting. In a single American or European city, you can find solemn Catholic masses with incense and ancient liturgy, contemporary evangelical services with rock bands and video projections, Eastern Orthodox celebrations following the Julian calendar, and therefore happening weeks later, secular gatherings that celebrate holiday spirit without specific religious content, multicultural festivals incorporating traditions from immigrant communities, and individuals who simply do not celebrate at all. This diversity is, depending on perspective, wonderful richness or troubling fragmentation. There is no longer a cultural center that everyone shares, just multiple gravitational centers, each attracting different segments of the population. Contemporary churches navigate this plurality with varied strategies. Some megachurches produce elaborate Christmas spectacles that rival professional theatrical productions, nativity enactments with specially constructed sets, dramatic lighting effects, live animals, even artificial snow. The goal is to create an experience so engaging that it will compete with secular entertainment for people's attention. Other churches, often smaller or more traditional, do exactly the opposite. They emphasize simplicity, silence, contemplation, offering refuge from the cacophony of commercial and digital noise that dominates cultural Christmas. Lessons and carols services, where biblical readings alternate with hymns sung by the congregation by candlelight, are popular precisely because they offer an experience that cannot be replicated digitally or bought in a store. There is a market, we might say cynically, or genuine human need, we might say more generously, for both approaches. Questions of social justice permeate contemporary Christmas in new ways. There is growing awareness of the inequalities that Christmas can exacerbate. Children in poor families, painfully aware they will not receive the expensive gifts they see advertised. Retail workers forced to work long hours during the year's most lucrative season, often missing time with their own families. The massive environmental footprint of Christmas consumption, billions of dollars in products, much of it produced under questionable labor conditions, shipped around the world, burning fossil fuels, much of it destined to end up in landfills months later. Christian social justice movements argue that celebrating the birth of Jesus, who was born in poverty, identified with the marginalized, challenged systems of power, requires attention to these issues. Some propose fair trade Christmas focused on ethically produced gifts, donations to charity instead of material gifts, volunteering at shelters and community kitchens. It is an attempt to reconnect Christmas to its roots in the message of good news to the poor. Environmentally, there is a growing movement of green Christmas or sustainable Christmas. Artificial versus natural trees is debated endlessly. The answer depends on complex factors. Natural trees are biodegradable but require land, water, pesticides. Artificial ones do not require new resources annually, but are typically made of petroleum-derived plastic and are not biodegradable. LED lights have reduced energy consumption, but outdoor light installations have become competitions in some neighborhoods, with houses displaying tens of thousands of lights. Gift wrapping generates tons of waste. Travel for family reunions contributes significantly to carbon emissions. For those concerned about climate change, these issues are not trivial. They are moral dilemmas about how to celebrate consistently with one's values. And they generate conflicts between generations, between those who prioritize tradition versus those who prioritize sustainability, between personal pleasure and collective responsibility. Commercially, Christmas is more dominant than ever, but also more criticized. The Christmas shopping season now effectively begins in October or even September in some retailers. Stores decorate and play Christmas music earlier and earlier, trying to maximize the sales window. This results in the phenomenon of Christmas fatigue, people tired of saturation long before the day itself arrives. There is also growing cynicism about the emotional manipulation of Christmas advertising, which routinely uses themes of family, love, generosity, and even spirituality to sell products. Some consumers respond with boycotts, committing to buy nothing, or buying only used or handmade items. Others try to buy local to sustain their communities. But the majority, despite discomfort with extreme commercialization, participate because alternatives are difficult. Refusing to give gifts can seem stingy or may disappoint children. Resisting completely requires energy and planning that many do not have during an already stressful season. For contemporary children, Christmas is often an experience of material abundance without historical precedent. It is not uncommon for middle-class children to receive dozens of gifts from parents, grandparents, aunts, friends of the family. Trees disappear under piles of wrapped packages, and then comes Christmas morning, often recorded on video, a frenzy of tearing paper, opening boxes, brief exclamations of excitement before moving on to the next one. Within hours, it is over. Mountains of wrapping paper go to recycling. New toys join the many they already owned. Some parents report feeling empty afterward, all the planning, spending, stress for this moment that passes so quickly. And there is concern about what this abundance teaches: gratitude or entitlement, appreciation or consumerism. Some parents are intentionally trying to change this. Fewer gifts, but more thoughtful ones, experience gifts instead of objects, involving children in giving to those less fortunate. But swimming against the cultural tide is a constant challenge. Demographically, Western societies are changing in ways that affect Christmas. Populations are aging, birth rates are falling, traditional nuclear families are less universal, replaced by a variety of family structures. Increasingly, people live alone, particularly the elderly. For these individuals, Christmas can be a period of acute loneliness. There are community efforts to address this: community Christmas dinners, visitation programs for the elderly, emotional support hotlines that operate especially during holidays. But the scale of the problem is large, and solutions are partial. Paradoxically, in an era of unprecedented digital connection, human isolation is a significant social problem, and holidays centered on family and unity make that isolation more painful. Religiously, the West is becoming more secular. Research shows consistent declines in religious attendance, belief in God, and identification with Christian denominations, especially among young people. What does this mean for Christmas? For some, it means that Christmas is finally freeing itself from religious baggage and becoming a pure humanist festival of love, family, and generosity, values that do not require theistic faith. For others, it is a tragic loss of meaning, a reduction of profound sacred mystery to empty sentimentalism and unchecked consumerism. Both perspectives contain truths. Contemporary secular Christmas can be meaningful and even spiritual in its own way, centering important human values. But it has also lost the theological depths and cosmic narrative that Christianity offered. God entering creation, the divine embracing humanity, eternity touching time. This narrative gave Christmas gravity, meaning that transcended individual circumstances. Without it, Christmas can feel shallower, more vulnerable to reduction to mere consumerism. And yet, surprisingly, Christmas persists and even thrives. There is something in it that meets deep human needs that transcend religious particulars. The need for ritual marking the passage of time, the need for gathering in the dark and cold period of the year in the Northern Hemisphere, the need for generosity and connection in a world often competitive and isolating, the need for beauty, light, and celebration, even, especially, in difficult times. These human needs are constant, and Christmas, through all its historical mutations, has proven remarkably adaptable in meeting them. Perhaps it is precisely this adaptability that ensures its survival. Christmas can be shaped to serve the needs of different eras, cultures, and individuals. It is not fixed, but fluid, not monolithic, but multiple. And in this multiplicity lies its resilience. The Christmas we celebrate today carries echoes of 2,000 years of history, each era adding layers, some being preserved, others being transformed, still others being forgotten. And tomorrow? The Christmas our great-grandchildren celebrate will be different again, shaped by technologies and challenges we have not yet imagined. But if history has taught us anything, it is that Christmas will continue, evolving, adapting, persisting. And perhaps that is, in itself, one of the most profound messages of this long journey through the centuries. that there is something in us, humans, that seeks celebration, connection, meaning, and hope. And we will continue creating rituals that express these yearnings no matter how the world around us changes. And so we arrive at the end of this long journey through the centuries, beginning in the dark catacombs of ancient Rome and ending in the bright and infinite digital spaces of our present. We have traveled 2,000 years of human history through the lens of a single celebration, Christmas, and in the process, we have witnessed something extraordinary: the remarkable resilience of the human spirit, its capacity to create and maintain meaning even in the most unlikely circumstances, its deep need for ritual beauty and connection that no ideology, technology, or catastrophe seems able to completely extinguish. Think for a moment about all we have seen. We saw primitive Christian communities celebrating the birth of Christ in underground tunnels, whispering prayers by the light of flickering lamps, knowing that discovery could mean public execution. And yet they celebrated because the story they told, of God becoming vulnerable as a human baby, of light entering darkness, of hope being born in the most unlikely circumstances, that story was too powerful to be silenced by fear. We saw Christmas emerge from those shadows to occupy the most magnificent basilicas of the empire, transformed from an act of clandestine resistance into an imperial celebration of power and pomp. We saw medieval monks maintain prayer vigils through freezing winter nights, their voices weaving Gregorian chants that seemed to suspend time itself. We saw peasants enact Christmas dramas in village squares, temporarily transforming blacksmiths into Joseph, bakers' wives into Mary, children into angels, suspended by ropes, bringing the sacred story into tangible three-dimensional life. We saw the Reformation nearly destroy Christmas, theologians arguing it was corrupt human tradition without biblical basis, governments literally making celebration illegal, soldiers patrolling streets looking for signs of forbidden festivity, and yet Christmas survived because ordinary people, farmers, merchants, mothers and fathers, refused to completely abandon something that gave structure and meaning to their years, that marked time not merely chronologically, but emotionally and spiritually. We saw the Enlightenment question the religious foundations of Christmas, and in response we saw Christmas transform, finding new justifications, new meanings, if not as celebration of divine incarnation, then as celebration of human values of family, generosity and community that even skeptics could endorse. We saw soldiers in the trenches of the First World War, surrounded by death and devastation, pausing their war to sing together on Christmas Eve, to play football in no man's land, to bury their dead with shared dignity. That Christmas truce of 1914 remains one of the most moving and tragic moments in human history. Moving because it revealed that our shared humanity can, even briefly, transcend constructed enmities. Tragic because the war resumed, proving that recognizing common humanity is not enough to overcome the forces, political, economic, ideological, that divide us and set us against one another. But that moment persists in collective memory precisely because it shows us that another world is possible, even if only for a few hours, even in the midst of hell. We saw television create mass shared Christmas, millions of families watching the same specials, singing the same songs, buying versions of the same gifts advertised in the same commercials. We saw Christmas globalize, Western traditions spreading to corners of the world where Christianity was a minority or non-existent, and simultaneously we saw non-Western traditions enrich Christmas in their own contexts, creating unique syntheses: Filipino Christmas with its midnight masses and paper lanterns, Ethiopian Christmas with its 40-day fast and rock-hewn churches, Mexican Christmas with its posadas and piñatas. We saw Christmas multiply into 1,000 culturally specific variations, each valid, each meaningful to those who practice it. And finally, we saw Christmas enter the digital era, where virtual connection coexists with real solitude, where infinite options of personalized entertainment replaced shared cultural experiences, where celebrations are both performed for cameras and lived in the present moment, where algorithms suggest gifts and artificial intelligence tells Christmas stories to children. We saw the contradictions of this era, more connected yet often more isolated, more material abundance but often less genuine satisfaction, more efficiency in everything but less genuine time for what really matters. So what have we learned from this epic journey through time? Perhaps this: that Christmas was never really about just one thing. It was never merely religious or merely secular, merely sacred or merely cultural, merely about spiritual transcendence or merely about immanent human connection. It has always been, in different proportions in different contexts, about all of these simultaneously, and different people, at different times, emphasize different aspects according to their needs, values, and circumstances. The devout Christian in the catacombs and the secular consumer in the shopping mall are, in some profound sense, participating in the same cultural phenomenon, a moment marked on the calendar as special, worthy of effort, attention, and celebration, even though their reasons and their methods are radically different. We also learned that celebrations, rituals, and traditions are not fixed and immutable, but living and constantly evolving. Each generation receives traditions from the previous one, but inevitably modifies them, sometimes consciously as an act of reform or rebellion, more often unconsciously through gradual adaptations to changing circumstances. The Christmas you celebrate is different from what your parents celebrated, which was different from what their parents celebrated, and so on, in an unbroken chain stretching back through the centuries. And yet there are remarkable continuities. The story of birth in Bethlehem is still told. Silent Night is still sung, candles are still lit against the darkness, gifts are still given, families still gather when possible. There is something recognizable that persists through all the transformations. Perhaps the most profound lesson is about hope. Not naive hope that ignores suffering and injustice, but persistent hope that fully acknowledges them and still chooses to celebrate, create beauty, affirm meaning. Christians in the catacombs had every reason to despair. They were a persecuted minority in a vast and hostile empire, but they celebrated the birth of their Messiah, affirming that light had come into the world and darkness would not overcome it. Soldiers in the trenches were living a literal nightmare, but on Christmas Eve, they chose humanity over hatred, connection over violence, at least temporarily. Families in times of war, poverty, disease, in all eras, people facing hardship chose to mark Christmas in some way, create a moment of joy, or at least pause, affirm that life is more than mere survival. And we now, in our complicated present, with our specific challenges, climate change, growing inequality, political polarization, epidemic loneliness, digital exhaustion, still celebrate Christmas. Perhaps in ways that leave us ambivalent, perhaps with acute awareness of contradictions and hypocrisies, perhaps with longing for simpler or more meaningful versions we imagine once existed. But we celebrate. And in that celebration, however imperfect, there is something profoundly human and perhaps even sacred. The refusal to allow difficulty to have the last word, the insistence on creating moments of light even in dark times, the maintenance of practices that connect us with the past and with one another, the act of giving even when resources are limited, the effort to gather even when it is inconvenient, the choice to celebrate life even while fully aware of its fragility. If this journey through the centuries has touched your heart, we invite you to join the Sleeping Times community. We are more than a channel, we are a family of history explorers, of curious souls who find comfort in the narratives that have shaped humanity. By subscribing, you are not merely following a channel, you are entering a space where each story is a bridge between past and present, where each narrative is carefully woven to educate, calm, and inspire. Turn on notifications so you do not miss our next journeys. We have medieval Templars, the Silk Roads, Tibetan monasteries, the great lost libraries of antiquity waiting for you. And your voice matters to us. In the comments, share which historical period resonates most with you. What aspects of this Christmas journey surprised you, or simply say hello. We love getting to know each member of our community. Together we continue exploring the extraordinary stories that make us human. As you prepare to sleep tonight, carry with you this final reflection. Through 2,000 years, through war and peace, persecution and freedom, poverty and prosperity, darkness and light, the celebration persisted. Not because some authority demanded it, not because it is easy or simple, but because it meets something profound in us. The need to mark time with meaning, to connect with others, to intentionally create beauty and joy even when they do not arise naturally, to tell stories that remind us who we are and who we could be. You are part of this long human chain, connected through time to all those who celebrated before you, their celebrations echoing theirs in ways you may never fully perceive. And so, as the night enfolds you and sleep comes gently, know that the light, whether the light of candles in catacombs, of stained glass windows in cathedrals, of bonfires in trenches, of decorated trees in living rooms, or of screens that illuminate our faces in darkness, the light persists. Through all the changes, through all the eras, through all the challenges, it persists. And as long as there are humans who choose to light a candle against the darkness, who choose to sing even when there is little to sing about, who choose to give even when they have little, who choose to gather even when it is difficult, who choose to celebrate life even knowing fully of its brevity, as long as there is that, there will be Christmas in some form, called by some name, keeping alive the flame that millennia have not been able to extinguish. Rest well, traveler, through time. The story continues, and you are part of it. Good night.